What's the creepiest thing you have encountered during your military service? Story 1, creepy at first, ended in a facepalm. I was a young sergeant in 2006, stationed at Fort Bliss. Right outside of Fort Bliss was a training area that was near Biggs Airfield. We were guarding some equipment overnight so the company wouldn't have to stay. It was me and one private person. I told him he would take shifts patrolling, and since we were allowed to have cars out there, the other would nap in his car. I woke up to my soldier knocking on my window in a complete panic. It scared me at first. Private: Sergeant, wake up. There's UFOs out here. Me: what? Private points in the direction, and sure as hell I see these lights that seemed like they were floating around and then disappearing. Took me a moment as I had just woken up. That's the Franklin Mountain Range. You're looking at the cars driving on the scenic route. The cars would be visible and then disappear when they went around the corner of a turn, only to appear again when they came back around. I was very agitated at first, but the next day it was by far the funniest experience I had in the military. Story 2, U.S. Navy photographer here. In the deepest parts of the ocean, you will often steam past small boats that are empty or seemingly empty. Sometimes they look like they got loose and no one looked for them. Sometimes they look disgusting, like someone lived in them until they couldn't. Sometimes it's obvious someone is still in them, but they haven't moved for weeks. Story 3. I'm not in the military, but I did read Hal Moore's book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and there were multiple instances of North Vietnamese soldiers just walking straight up to U.S. forces in the middle of combat. They'd look at them and they wouldn't even raise their weapon or unsling it. They would just start laughing at the U.S. soldiers. Then the U.S. guys would shoot them. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation of why this happened, but it's pretty creepy that the enemy might just walk up to you and start laughing in your face, seemingly not caring whether you shoot them or not. Story 4. I was working the night shift in an old skiff that was originally built back in the 50s. I was starting to feel sleepy, so I went for a walk to wake myself up, and ended up getting lost in the maze of underground tunnels, finding myself in a part of the complex that obviously hadn't been used in decades. Everything looked like it was just left there and forgotten one day, eerily frozen in time. I was extremely tired and stressed out from work, and that really didn't help me to be able to rationally retrace my steps. Everything around me seemed like something was hiding in the shadows and watching me. It took a long time, but I finally made it back to my position and didn't tell anyone what happened. Luckily, it was the night shift and no one noticed I was gone. A year later, we got a new guy, and in the middle of the night shift, he got up and went for a walk. A couple of hours later, he came back looking like he'd seen a ghost. I just gave him a knowing nod, and he knew I knew exactly what he just went through. Story 5, we wrote it off as some of the instructors messing with us. But while training at JWTC, there was a blood-curdling scream in the middle of the night. Definitely sounded like a woman. The Lility in charge made us do a quick accountability check. Then he started radioing the training center to see what the hell happened. The instructors went out from their compound and did some checks, but didn't find anything. They said it's not the first time they had units out there calling in to report the same thing. Story 6. Is a dude vanishing spooky enough? I was on one rooftop on post with another Marine, and on the building next to mine was a dude smoking a cigarette. I looked to my partner to mention it, but when we looked again, he was gone. The roof access door for that building was very rusty and loud, so there's no way he snuck out in those few seconds it took to get my partner's attention. Story 7. Not my story, so I'll tell it as best I can. This happened during a rotation at the National Training Center sometime in 2015. A battle was occurring at night, a light appeared in the sky, and for 10 minutes or so there was silence. This may not seem too interesting until you look at the numbers and statistics. You're looking at massive amounts of people and equipment during a rotation, constant radio chatter, vehicle noise, people talking, etc., and suddenly just nothing. Then the light seemed to make a couple strange turns, one being around 90 degrees, and split and disappear. Story 8. One time at an Air Force base in the ROK, we had a power outage at night. All of us walked out of our hangar doors to see what the problem may have been, and we saw a very, very large triangular shape passing over our hangar. It was a clear, moonless night previously, and when we went outside to look around, we noticed the starscape being covered and then slowly uncovered. No sound associated with the event other than normal sounds of the location. I'll never forget. Story 9. Used to be F-22 avionics for the USAF, 2A3 up 2, no shred, At an undisclosed base, a light appeared above the flight line, moving in odd ways and hovering. We called it into our number 1, and he called other AMUs to ensure there were no sorties being flown that we didn't know about. Shortly after, F-22s and 16s were scrambled and could not intercept the object. It disappeared into the night. We saw this go down from our flight. Shortly after, we were informed that this never happened. Story 10, Navy. When I was in Groton, CT, for basic enlisted submarine school, I was roving the barracks at night. I had a UI under instruction, so I was showing him the ropes, what to check and how to check. It was mainly fire extinguishers and secured doors. Well, on the 2nd or 3rd floor of the barracks, there is a recreation room with a TV and chairs and a piano. Mind you, everyone was asleep and it was 0200 in the morning. Well, I decided to go and see if I remembered how to play the piano a little. We decided to continue to finish the patrol, so we started walking down the hall when we heard a single piano note go off. We both heard it while I was in mid-conversation, so we kind of looked back, and then we both looked at each other to see if we both had heard the same noise. We shrugged it off as our imaginations ran wild, but as soon as we got to the end of the hall and opened the door to the stairway, a sharp keynote was heard coming from down the hall in the direction of the room with the piano. We left the floor as soon as possible and later shared the story with some shipmates, and they told us stories of sailors that had died in the barracks. Story 11. One of my drill sergeants actually has a creepy story from one of his Afghanistan deployments. He was infantry, so being in the field and out of missions for multiple weeks wasn't uncommon. One night, while sleeping in a fighting position, he felt something nibbling at his feet. He woke up and kicked it off, and what he saw wasn't any type of marsupial, but a little humanoid figure he could only describe as looking just like Gollum. But being in the field with little sleep, he chalked it up to just seeing things. A couple of days later, he and another guy, and on watch, and the other guy pointed out something and said, "What the hell is that?" and pointed at a stone wall in the distance. My drill sergeant looked through his binoculars, and crawling across the top of this stone wall was the exact little humanoid creature he encountered a few nights before. Story 12, former USCG here. Saw a ghost and some creepy crap happen when we were removing the old Fresnel lens from the Presque Isle light in Michigan. Also, I saw some weird creepy lights in St. Elmo's fire near the old Wago Chance light. Compasses and radios all quit. Radar and GPS wouldn't work either. The light near Sturgeon Bay is haunted as well, and we stayed at the light near Two Rivers, and the whole family saw the ghost. There are several lights in the Great Lakes that are open to active reserve and retired military members as vacation rentals. We stayed at Raleigh Point Lighthouse and the Sherwood Point Lighthouse. They have visitor logs that are like a diary, and multiple stories are in there about the hauntings dating back to the 70s. I know that Sherwood Point is haunted. Story 13. I worked in Arlington National Cemetery while I was in the Army. The tomb guards always talked about seeing or just hearing soldiers marching some nights. We were cataloging graves one night when I thought I saw a soldier in my team up ahead, so I called him over. He answered from behind me. When I looked back, the other soldier was gone. I am a skeptic, and I believe everything paranormal has a real-world explanation, but I'm still trying to figure that one out. Story 14. I saw a UFO when I was in basic training at Fort Leonard Wood. I was walking from one building to another to start my fire watch shift when I noticed something as bright as a star make a zigzagging pattern at impossible speeds and then disappear over the horizon. I had never been more clear-headed and sober in my life, so I'm sure I saw something. Story 15. My dad swears up and down that he saw something blip on the radar while at sea in a way that meant it was traveling at ridiculous speeds. He was an anti-air missile guy in the US Navy back in the 70s and early 80s. Not paranormal, but he also told me about how when they came into port in, I think was Romania, the KGB types would try to act like civilians and ask them things like how much money the sailors made and such. Of course, my dad told them he owned like 5 sports cars back home, made 6 figures, and that the missiles on his ship could accurately hit targets well beyond their actual range. Story 16. When I was deployed, we worked out of this ancient dock from the Vietnam era. I worked in a graveyard, so there were never any people there at night except mission essential for any missions we were running. We would randomly hear footsteps walking down the small hallway that was a dead end. Our door was the last one before the little bit that was the dead end. No one ever walked past our door, but there were always the footsteps. One night, there were wet footprints down there and it wasn't even raining outside. Story 17. While serving in the US Army in Germany in the 80s, my job was to guard the border and do patrols at night. One night we came upon a balloon flying through the sky from the east. This was a no-fly zone, and to see this balloon freaked myself and my sergeant out. Later on, we found out that it was defectors from East Germany and their families flying in the balloon, and they landed safely about 4 miles from us. Although I never got to see the family, I later found they had tried once before and failed. Freedom at all costs. I still have chills from seeing that thing blasting the gas nozzles to lift it along. Turned out to be a huge event, and the balloon caught fire and almost crashed. Shocking to see that thing coming across the border and wondering what it was. Story 18. Not US, but here we go. My grandfather was a pilot in the Turkish Air Force way back. As being part of NATO, they sent them to Canada to attend the Air Force Academy. Just to give you some context, he is a very uptight and serious person. Often the reason being a soldier comes into play. He is the reason why I know a lot of astrophysics. He guided me to science and facts his entire life. R.I.P. Anyway, he told me he and the rest of the school, including the flight instructors, witnessed an UFO hovering above the main building. He said it came so close to the ground that it was basically impossible to not notice it. Then, just as baffled as people are, UFOs just shoot straight up almost instantly, must be pulling G-force that would easily kill a human being. I have never seen a UFO with my own eyes. Every object I have ever seen in the sky had an easy explanation. Some took longer to realize, but now it comes to me very naturally. I'm a little skeptical about whole aliens visiting Earth, but science says it is not impossible. Fermi's paradox can be easily solved. Edit. I just talked with my mother. Also, he is my mother's father. She gave me some more details I couldn't remember. It was during the winter of 1958 to 1959 and after the meal. My grandfather didn't like to talk about these things in general. Only after I pushed him harder did he spill some more detail, but I forgot some of the details. Thanks, Mom. Story 19. I wish I could remember the specifics of this story, but I'll try to recount it as best I can. My grandfather was in the British military. He was charged with leading soldiers through a wooded area. I don't recall his rank or where he was serving at that time. A course was plotted and they moved on during the night. Suddenly, a glowing hand appeared before my grandfather's face as if to say, "Stop." He was so disturbed by what he witnessed that he took it as a sign to redirect his crew on a different path. That night, another group of soldiers on their original path came under enemy fire, but my grandfather's crew was safe. To this day, he strongly believes he witnessed the hand of God. He has never been excessively religious, does not attend church, and has never experienced anything like that before or since. I must try to get more details on this story. Story 20. U.S. Air Force here, not allowed to say what I do, but my frame flew in Vietnam and carried dead bodies back, and after Vietnam it was repurposed. All of the older frames from that era are supposedly haunted by dead soldiers. I've spent shifts, midnight 7 a.m. on these frames, and I've heard people scream out in pain. I've asked for a tool and had someone hand it to me and then turn around and they were gone. Multiple times you'll hear someone's name being called. I don't believe in ghosts, but those frames creep me out. Story 21. My dad was in Saudi during Desert Storm. He worked in a fairly tall building, like 5-6 stories, and was one of the tallest ones there. Well, they'd get bored and go to the roof and throw water balloons at people. They were told not to by some higher-ups, but my dad was the commander of the unit and they did it anyway as the unit commander before him did. One day, they got a package in the mail. In it were pics of them on the roof with targets in marker drawn on them. They never found out where or who they came from. They still went up to the roof, but only threw water balloons at night. Story 22. My friend was in the U.S. Army in Korea, stationed right on the DMZ, but in the middle of nowhere. Across the small valley on the NK side was a propaganda village where nobody lives but is made up to look like a nice place. They had these loudspeakers that would go all day with propaganda directed toward the South Koreans, talking about how they would be squashed by the North if they attacked, etc. His birthday was on a nice mild night in late summer, while sitting outside enjoying the quiet darkness, smoking a cigarette and stargazing. The loudspeakers in the NK village start blaring in English, "Happy birthday, Private Joseph Michael Smith, Social Security number 123456789. Your mother, Nancy, and your father, Robert, miss you dearly and anxiously await your safe return home." My friend was sufficiently freaked the hell out after that. He did stay at the location for the rest of his tour, but nobody ever found out exactly how his personal information got leaked. Story 23. Navy Boot Camp, Orlando. I was alone on watch in our company's barracks compartment. I was checking all the windows because the CC liked to unlock one or two to make sure we checked them all. That put me between the racks, bunk beds, and the wall. I caught movement down the middle open area of the compartment, a flash of white. White shoes meant brand new recruits. We had been there longer enough we were wearing our black Oxfords. I went between the racks to the middle so I could see who had come into the compartment. The outside door definitely hadn't opened, and I would have heard the door by the inside stairwell. The door to the laundry area was locked. Standing across the open area, by the other row of racks, was a girl with curly dark hair wearing the same female utilities as me, a light blue shirt and black pants. She was wearing the white tennis shoes, which meant she'd only been there a couple weeks. She looked at me, then she wasn't there. No place for her to go. We were in the middle of the compartment, yards from any door and nowhere to hide. I didn't see her move. She just wasn't there from one moment to the next, only saw her for a heartbeat or two. Spookier still, years later, our new FN was telling about a roving patrol watch at boot camp and how they kept finding a pair of white sneakers in the locked laundry room of an empty compartment. Freaked her out. Said the red lights always looked darker in there. They'd do their checks and leave as fast as they could. However, one of the CCs was playing a joke with the shoes. I asked which building, which wing, and which floor. Yep, my old compartment where I had seen the girl. Story 24. On board the aircraft carrier John C. Stennis, there is a supply store room about 5 ladder wells down, near the aft end of the ship. The story goes that because of the heat in it, a supply PO had a heart attack and died. The story is that his spirit is still up in there, and if you turn the light out and ask him to show up, he will knock a lot of stuff around to let you know he is there. We were told that on Halloween, he has the ability to touch you too. When we were deployed on the ship, a lot of our folks tried it out, and when Halloween came around, it was amusing to see just how many folks were actually afraid to do it. Story 25. I don't remember if I've shared this before, and I'm still not sure if I really saw what I thought I saw. The airman that was with me seemed to see it too. Around 2015, I was in the truck training a new airman on flight line driving at night when we were doing a routine inspection of the equipment out there. He knew what he was doing, so I just stared and gazed like I loved to. It was a clear night, so it was perfect. After a minute, I noticed stars were disappearing in clusters and reappearing after a second, and realized something really dark and large was gliding over top of us. I told my coworker to look at it, and he saw it too. It was this giant crescent-shaped thing just silently flying overhead west away from the mountains. It was seriously bizarre, and I've never seen anything like it before. I still have no idea what it was. I should ask him if he remembers that. Story 26. I was a military police officer stationed in Germany. We would get calls every now and then of a woman and/or child screaming in the vicinity of the high school on post. When we got there, nothing would be happening, and none of our German gate guards heard a thing. Occasionally, we'd have to go search the high school to make sure nobody was in it after hours. Doorknobs were known to be spinning all the way around with nobody turning them. We'd also get calls about hearing screaming from a Polish prisoner of war cemetery on the post, which is off a dirt road from an almost never used area of the training area. We'd get there and it'd always be foggy as hell, with nobody there. Story 27, 2003 in Baghdad. My unit came in May right after the initial push. We took over a compound that looked like an Iraqi base. Anyways, we are setting up sleeping quarters and my unit takes over the old medical building. We can clearly see blood on the stairs, and I'm not talking sprinkles, I'm talking puddles of blood from the until that had come before us and clearly saw combat in that building. A few days go by and I'm lying down on my cot at night trying to go to sleep when suddenly I feel someone looking at me. As I looked up, I saw a soldier that clearly wasn't American. It was an old Iraqi soldier just standing there in the middle of the room. I'm sure it wasn't just me being half asleep because another one of my friends mentioned it a few days later. It was really creepy. Story 28. I used to work in a building that was a barracks during the Pearl Harbor attack. You walk up to the building and there are bullet holes everywhere, even in a lot of the stairs and hallways. They won't restore it for historical reasons. Story 29. Looked for someone else telling this story, disappointed in my fellow Okinawa Marines. When I was on the rock, there was one gate leading off the base that was always locked, and the official reason for it was unclear. The Japanese gate guards would tell me it's because when they're out there alone in the middle of the night, an American man in a very worn World War II uniform would walk up, ask for a light, and then walk back into the darkness. Okinawa was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the war. A lot of weird crap used to happen when I was on night shift, hearing footsteps, doors closing, lights turning off and on for no reason, and stuff like that. Sometimes I'd hear traditional Okinawan music coming from the jungle at 3 in the morning. Anyway, I had plenty of overnight shifts there, and I'd get tired and go for a walk. Well, I'd end up in a hallway that looked like it was left behind a long time ago, and then all of a sudden the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees, and music, that I would presume to be 40s style music, starts playing. I went back to my office and freaked the heck out. And turns out coworkers have a lot of eerie experiences as well. Story 30 USMC 6541 happened while I was in the service, but not necessarily related to the military. My grandmother died when I was 15. She told all of us in the family that if we got tattoos to remember her by, she would haunt us. When I was in my first year, I went to a local tattoo shop in Pensacola, FL, just off base at NAS, Pensacola. I had a tattoo drawn up of a pair of wings and my grandparents' names on either side. When the artist got started with my grandmother's name, the room temperature dropped what felt like 20 degrees. It was that cold until he was done. It was 95 degrees out that day, and I swear it was 30 in the room. My aunt, who also got a tattoo in remembrance of my grandmother, said the same thing. As soon as the artist started, the room got cold as ice and stayed that way until he had finished. Story 31. My brother was part of a military security detail. He was in the military, not a contractor. I won't go into detail to protect him, but some top-secret hardware was being delivered to his base by train. They knew when it was coming and they were on full alert. All this is normal, except when the train arrived with the hardware. It was invisible, the entire train. It appeared out of thin air. He said it must have been cloaked somehow for its journey, and when it did appear, there were men standing on each train car, dressed in black and wearing face masks. It wasn't cold, so many questions, but that was his account, and I absolutely believe him. My brother is a very straight-laced guy. Story 32. My dad temporarily worked at the missile fields back when we're stationed in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the place was just old. F.E. Warren. It was relatively quiet, but in the basements and in between, there would be doors opening and closing and noises about. Nothing out of the ordinary for what you'd consider paranormal, but it's certainly unsettling when you barely have anyone with you and you're underground. As far as I know, what happened had to do with missile engineers falling or getting trapped in the silos. Story 33. Active duty infantryman here. During basic training, we left the barracks to do some training for the day. When we came back, all of our shoes and boots were thrown all over the bay. There were shoes and boots all over the place. What's weird is that once we started organizing our boots the way our drill sergeants instructed us to at the beginning of the cycle, it never happened again. Spooky, huh? Stuff like this happens all the time. For this one time, our drill sergeant tipped over every bunk in the room and threw all the mattresses and sheets around because someone had left their bunk undone. Well, he left, and about 7 minutes later, he walked back in, and to his surprise, all of the beds were perfectly aligned and made to standard. Come on, don't tell me you don't believe in ghosts after that.